Hey, it's Mark here, and welcome to the next edition of the Employee Survival Guide, where I tell you, as always, what your employer does definitely not want you to know about, and a lot more.
Welcome to another episode of the Employee Survival Guide, produced by employment attorney Mark Carey. You know, when you look at the architecture of the modern corporate world, we're all sort of conditioned to believe in the predictability of the corporate ladder.
Right, exactly. The physics of it are supposed to be pretty simple.
Yeah, you put in the grueling hours, you generate revenue, your performance reviews glow, and, the ladder just holds your weight as you climb.
That's the social contract, right?
Exactly. But what happens when that ladder is suddenly, deliberately dismantled right out from under you while you're standing on it?
It's terrifying. And today we're bringing you into a fascinating exploration of a really high-stakes corporate legal battle that reveals exactly how that happens.
We're looking at a federal lawsuit, Malkani v. Gartner, Inc., alongside a really revealing March 2026 memorandum and order from U.S. District Judge Sarah F. Russell.
Yeah, and this case is honestly a masterclass in the mechanics of modern employment law.
It really is. We want to show you exactly how a toxic work environment gets built, how corporate HR systems can structurally fail their top performers. And finally, there's this massive legal plot twist involving a 2021 federal law.
Oh, the EFAA. It is completely blowing the doors off corporate forced arbitration right now.
It's wild. So to understand the gravity of the legal claims here, we really have to establish the plaintiff's baseline first. Robert Malkani is not, some marginal employee grasping at straws to save a failing career.
No, not at all. He's a 53-year-old managing vice president.
Right, with an elite pedigree. I mean, we're talking degrees from Dartmouth and Harvard Law.
Yeah.
His resume includes heavyweight institutions like Bridgewater, BlackRock, Cravath.
And importantly, his tenure at Gartner actually reflects that pedigree.
Yeah.
The filings show that from 2018 to 2022, Malkani received 4 consecutive years of E ratings.
And he stands for exceeds expectations, right?
Exactly. And in the highly competitive consulting and advisory sector, maintaining that kind of rating for half a decade, that requires an impeccable documented track record.
Seamless cross-team collaboration, high performance, all of it.
Right.
So if I'm looking at this from just an analytical perspective, an established multi-year track record of excellence is a massive hurdle for any employer trying to later claim, poor performance.
Oh, absolutely. It's the ultimate defense for an employee.
So when you see a sudden, steep drop-off in an executive standing right after a corporate reorganization, it's a classic red flag. And that pivot happens in January 2023.
Right. Gartner reorganizes.
Yep. And Malkani gets placed under a new, much younger manager named Eric Potts. It's like a championship sports team getting a new head coach who immediately and inexplicably just benches their star player.
That's a great analogy.
So I have to ask, is this just a classic personality clash, or does it cross the line into something actually illegal?
Well, that structural shift is exactly where the legal framework comes into play. It's important to establish right away for you listening that having a bad boss, or an aggressive boss, or even a totally incompetent boss, that isn't inherently illegal.
Right. The law doesn't enforce corporate politeness.
Exactly. It doesn't mandate good management. However, employment law kicks in with a vengeance when that mistreatment is inextricably linked to a protected characteristic.
Okay, so tied to who the person is.
Right. And Malkani alleges that the sudden shift in his standing had nothing to do with his performance. He claims it was explicitly driven by discriminatory animus regarding his age and his sex.
Let's examine the age allegations first, because the shift in tone happens almost instantly.
It's jarring how fast it happens.
Right. During their very first virtual get-to-know-you meeting, Potts allegedly offers to help Malkani, quote, handle things in this new virtual world.
Which is such a loaded phrase.
It immediately jumps out.
Yeah.
It relies on this really specific stereotype, the idea that a 53-year-old executive is somehow inherently out of touch with modern technology.
Despite the fact that he's functioning at the highest echelons of the tech consulting sector.
Right. So it sets this baseline of condescension that just quickly escalates. Potts allegedly begins referring to Malkani's strategic work as McKinsey bullshit and grammar school bullshit.
Yeah, he completely devalues his contributions.
And he starts addressing Malkani as Gramps in written communications. At one point he writes, quote, "Get with the program, Gramps," followed by a smiley face emoji.
The smiley face really just adds insult to injury there.
It's so passive-aggressive. He even explicitly tells Malkani to step aside on a major presentation to the CEO. He reallocates the opportunity to a younger worker because they supposedly possess more energy.
Classic ageist-coded language.
Energy.
Right. But I want to formulate a theory here, because calling someone Gramps feels like a blatant jerk move, sure. But maybe it's not a viable federal lawsuit on its own.
That's a fair question.
I imagine you have to prove a systemic pattern. Like, a judge isn't going to let a massive lawsuit proceed just because of a bad nickname in an email, right?
Your intuition is spot on. In employment discrimination law, courts rely on a standard known as the totality of the circumstances.
Okay, totality of the circumstances.
Right, so a judge isn't analyzing the word Gramps in a vacuum. They're evaluating that language combined with tangible adverse employment actions, the actual career damage.
Exactly. The complaint outlines a systemic structural dismantling of Malkani's role. Potts begins stripping Malkani of his direct reports. He actively kills open roles that Malkani already had approval to fill.
Oh, wow, so just hollowing out his department.
Yes, and reallocating those critical responsibilities to younger colleagues. And when Malkani pushes back and questions this, Potts allegedly snaps his fingers at him and tells him he needs to, quote, flex and grow.
So it's the linguistic markers of age bias.
Yeah.
The Gramps stuff paired with the actual gutting of his organizational power.
Exactly. When you stack the Gramps comments and the remarks about energy alongside the stripping of his managerial duties, plus cutting him out of CEO meetings, it creates a highly plausible legal narrative of discriminatory intent.
Because it shows real impact.
Yes. It demonstrates that the actual conditions of his employment were allegedly altered for the worse, specifically because of his age.
But when an executive is being isolated and targeted like this, it usually isn't just one vector of attack. And the complaint details an environment that became intensely and bizarrely sexually hostile.
Which introduces a legally crucial and honestly somewhat counterintuitive layer to the litigation.
Right. So the allegations state that Potts explicitly favored younger female subordinates. The complaint specifically points to colleagues like Magda Drobnicki and Deirdre Walsh.
Potts allegedly championed them, promoted them, and gave them Malkani's high-profile projects.
And it gets crazier. He eventually ordered Malkani, a managing VP, to essentially report to Drobnicki, who was a junior VP.
Just completely subverting the corporate hierarchy.
But the verbal environment surrounding all this is staggering. Potts allegedly makes explicit, highly inappropriate comments to Malkani about the physical attractiveness of their female colleagues.
Saying things like he would get wonderful all over that and get lovely all over that.
It's so gross. But then he turns this graphic sexual slang onto Malkani himself. Potts allegedly tells Malkani he needs to, quote, toss some word salad.
Deliberately leveraging a highly graphic slang term.
Right. And he later follows up by asking Malkani, how's the salad tossing going with a male coworker? He tells Malkani to isolate that coworker and that Malkani can do whatever you want with him.
And, this behavior wasn't just verbal. It actually extended into physical intimidation.
Yeah, let's talk about the bear hug.
When Malkani finally meets Potts in person, and it's really worth noting here that Potts is described as 6'4" and 250 pounds.
So very large guy.
Very large. Malkani extends his hand for a standard corporate handshake. Instead, Potts allegedly pulls him into a windowless room and subjects him to an overly forceful, prolonged bear hug.
That goes so far beyond a bad joke. Pulling a subordinate into a windowless room for a physical display of dominance crosses a massive line.
It absolutely does.
Wait, though, I understand this is incredibly toxic. I mean, it's boorish, it's terrible.
Yeah.
But from a strict statutory perspective, I'm looking at a male boss making crude, sexually charged jokes to a male subordinate. How does the court bridge the gap from inappropriate jokes to actionable sex discrimination against a man? It's not about sexual desire here, so what is the actual legal mechanism?
It's a highly nuanced area of Title VII law. But Judge Russell's March 2026 court order breaks the mechanism down brilliantly.
Okay, how does she interpret it?
The judge ruled that a plausible legal inference can be made that this hostility was based on sex because of disparate treatment.
Disparate treatment, meaning he was treated differently than the women.
Exactly. Malkani was the only man Potts directly supervised at that executive level, and he was the only one subjected to this belittling, physically intimidating, and highly sexualized treatment.
Ah, I see. Because the female colleagues were being treated with professional respect.
Right, they were being actively championed. Potts was allegedly acting entirely professionally and supportively toward his female subordinates, giving them clear directions, favorable projects, promotions.
So the contrast is the key.
Precisely. With his singular male direct report, He was allegedly engaging in relentless, hostile, demeaning, sexually charged banter. Therefore, the court can plausibly infer that Malkani was treated this way specifically because he was not a woman.
Wow. The stark contrast in how the men and the women were managed under the exact same supervisor is the legal linchpin.
It is. It's brilliant legal framing.
So when an executive is being isolated and targeted based on age and sex to this degree, the theoretical failsafe in the corporate structure is human resources, right?
In theory, yes.
But in Malkani's case, going to HR wasn't a rescue. It was actually the trigger for his termination.
And this is so vital for you, the listener, to understand about how corporate HR systems are structurally designed.
Tell me more about that structural design.
Well, the fundamental mandate of a corporate human resources department isn't necessarily to play impartial judge, or to deliver justice.
Risk management.
Exactly. Its primary function is to mitigate corporate risk and shield the organization from liability. When a high-level executive is accused of systemic discrimination, the structural reflex of the organization is often to just eliminate the complainer.
Rather than disrupt the management chain or admit liability.
Right. This is exactly why retaliation cases are so incredibly common in employment law.
And the timeline of the alleged retaliation in this specific case illustrates that reflex perfectly. Malkani's own team is actually begging him to report pods because the abuse is so visible to everyone.
It was bleeding out into the wider team.
Yeah. So Malkani attempts to warn senior executive Jim Whartonby. He gets entirely shut down. Whartonby allegedly tells him it's just, quote, Eric's way, and then immediately cancels all future one-on-one meetings with Malkani.
Just completely icing him out.
Yeah. So Malkani escalates. He goes to a senior HR executive, Lauren Ritchie. He goes to her twice. And her response, she allegedly tells him to just figure out what POTS wants.
Which is the exact opposite of an employer's legal obligation. When you get a protected complaint of age and sex discrimination, you have to conduct an impartial investigation.
You don't tell the victim to figure out what the abuser wants.
Exactly.
And it gets worse. Malkani realizes the informal channels are closed, right? So he sets up a meeting with a senior executive named Kate Elsom for January 9, 2024.
With the explicit intention of formally reporting the abuse.
Right. But 2 minutes before that virtual meeting is scheduled to start, an HR representative is suddenly added to the calendar invite.
The ambush.
Yep. Malkani logs onto the call, and he is fired on the spot. They label it a strategic review and tell him his role is being eliminated.
But Gartner had an internal policy allowing terminated employees a short grace period to secure another internal role before their employment officially ended.
Right. They gave him a tiny window. So Malkani leverages his network. He actually finds another role internally with an executive named Ernie Barraza. He gets the official offer on February 16th, 2024.
A lifeline.
A lifeline. And because he is hyper-aware of his vulnerability, he is terrified of being sabotaged by POTS again, Malkani explicitly asks for and secures a verbal promise of just cause employment protection from Barraza.
He wanted to know he was safe.
Right. He was assured they were in it for the long haul. Which brings us to the double firing.
Right. This is where it just goes off the rails.
On February 28th, exactly 2 days after he officially starts the new role, Barraza pulls him into a meeting with HR and fires him a second time.
2 days later.
2 days.
Yeah.
And the justification Gartner provides is that new information has suddenly come to light regarding Malkani's inability to collaborate with Team NCVI partners.
Which is such a massive textbook unforced error by the company.
Because Team NCVI partners, these are the internal national client value initiatives teams, right? They drive client value.
Yeah.
And Malkani had historically worked with those exact teams seamlessly.
Right. It hands the plaintiff a silver platter argument for pretext.
Okay, unpack pretext for us. Why would a company do that? Especially using an excuse that directly contradicts his actual track record.
Well, you've hit on the exact legal mechanism at play here. In retaliation claims, courts are always looking for pretext. That's a demonstrably false reason manufactured by the employer to mask a true discriminatory or retaliatory motive.
Basically a fake excuse.
Exactly. And the excuse that Malkani couldn't collaborate with Team NCVI partners just collapses under scrutiny.
Because of his past reviews.
Right. In his previous glowing performance reviews, his superiors specifically praised his exceptional collaboration skills with those exact partners.
And didn't they reach out to him when he got rehired?
Yes. On his very first day, back in the new role, the heads of those teams were allegedly messaging him congratulations. They explicitly stated they couldn't wait to work with him again.
So the company literally manufactured a cause that directly contradicted his documented history.
Allegedly, yes. And in employment law, timing is often the absolute most compelling evidence of retaliation.
Let's look at the timeline again.
The initial firing comes exactly 3 weeks after his explicit complaints to HR about POTS.
3 weeks.
Then, the second firing comes mere days after he secures a new foothold in the company, which neutralized their role elimination excuse.
So they had to invent a new reason?
Right. When an employer provides a demonstrably flimsy or false reason for a termination mere days or weeks after an employee engages in protected whistleblowing, it paints a glaring picture. It looks like a company executing a targeted strategy to silence a liability.
Okay, so Malkani is out. He sues. He brings the whole staggering timeline, the Gramps emails, the salad-tossing comments, the double firing, the HR stonewalling, all of it to federal court.
And Gartner immediately reaches for the ultimate corporate trump card.
Mandatory forced arbitration. Let's really unpack how this works because it's the invisible architecture of almost all modern corporate employment.
It really is. And it's entirely invisible to most employees until they actually need to sue. To understand what Gartner tried to do here, you have to understand the Federal Arbitration Act, or the FAA, which was passed way back in 1925.
Right, almost 100 years ago.
Originally, it was designed just to settle contract disputes between merchants. It wasn't for employees. But over the last few decades, courts have allowed corporations to apply it to employment contracts.
So today, when you sign your onboarding paperwork at almost any major corporation, buried in the fine print is a mandatory arbitration clause.
Exactly.
And what that clause means is that if your employer discriminates against you or steals your wages or retaliates against you, you waive your constitutional right to take them to a public court in front of a jury.
You're legally forced into a private, secretive arbitration setting.
Right. And the arbitrator is often paid by the employer. There's no public record, there's no media access, and it is notoriously difficult to appeal. It's essentially a legal vault designed to keep corporate dirty laundry permanently hidden.
That's a perfect way to describe it. So naturally, Gartner filed a motion to dismiss the sex claims and then compel the age discrimination, the retaliation, and the breach of contract claims into this secret arbitration vault.
But they slammed into a brick wall with Judge Russell.
They really did. Because the legal landscape fundamentally shifted in 2021 with the passage of the EFAA.
That's the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act.
Yes. This was a rare bipartisan piece of legislation passed in the direct wake of the Me Too movement. Congress recognized that forcing victims of sexual harassment into secret arbitration allowed systemic abusers to remain hidden in corporate structures.
Right, they could just keep moving from department to department.
Exactly. So the EFAA explicitly states that if an employee alleges sexual harassment or sexual assault, the employer's pre-dispute arbitration agreement is rendered completely invalid. The employee gets their day in a public court.
So wait, let me get this straight. Because Potts couldn't stop making salad-tossing jokes, Gartner's standard employment arbitration contract is totally voided.
That is exactly what happened.
This is where the specific wording of the law creates a massive vulnerability for the company, right? Mandatory arbitration is usually this corporate vault. But because Congress used the word case in the EFA legislation, a single sexual harassment claim acts like a legal skeleton key.
A skeleton key, yeah.
It unlocks the vault. And the age discrimination, the retaliation claims, and the breach of contract claims all spill out into the public square along with it. Is that an accurate read of the mechanism?
That is the exact mechanism, beautifully stated. Congress did not say the specific claim of sexual harassment is exempt from arbitration.
Right, they use the word case.
Yes, they explicitly legislated that the pre-dispute arbitration agreement is invalid with respect to the entire case. Judge Russell looked at the precedent, including the foundational Johnson v. Every Realm ruling, and affirmed this interpretation.
So because Malkani's hostile work environment claims regarding sex were deemed plausible, and they survived the initial motion to dismiss, the EFAA skeleton key just activated.
Exactly. The irony here is just astounding.
It really is. The very behavior that HR and leadership allegedly ignored, the crude jokes, the bear hug, the comments about female coworkers, that is the exact mechanism that legally destroys Gartner's ability to keep the ageism and the double firing quietly hidden in arbitration.
It's a perfect storm of legal consequences. The sexual harassment claim dragged the whole messy ordeal out of the shadows and right onto the public docket.
It proves that a single, aggressively toxic manager can inadvertently strip a multi-billion-dollar corporation of its most powerful legal shield.
Without even realizing it.
Let's trace the arc of what this means for you, the listener, and really for corporate America at large. We started with a highly educated, top-performing executive with an impeccable track record.
Right.
A reorganization happens. He gets a new boss, and instantly he's branded Gramps, stripped of his power, and subjected to bizarre physical intimidation and graphic sexual slang.
And then he pulls the emergency cord.
Right, it goes to human resources, the corporate failsafe. And the system not only fails to investigate, it actively coordinates a double firing, using easily disproven pretexts about his inability to collaborate.
And under the old rules of corporate law, Gartner likely would have successfully buried that entire narrative in a confidential arbitration room.
But Judge Russell, enforcing the 2021 EFAA, confirmed that those old rules just no longer apply. You don't get to hide this. You have to answer for the entirety of the retaliation and discrimination in the light of a public courtroom.
Which leaves us with a massive, highly provocative implication to consider.
Tell me.
Think about what this interpretation of the EFAA skeleton key means for the future of corporate HR departments. If a single plausible claim of sexual harassment can completely obliterate a company's mandatory arbitration agreement, exposing all of their other potential liabilities like ageism, wage theft, or systemic retaliation to public scrutiny, corporations are facing an existential threat to how they handle internal complaints.
Wow. It entirely rewrites the risk calculus for corporate defense. The liability of protecting a rainmaker manager who makes crude jokes now vastly outweighs the benefit.
Exactly. The math just doesn't work for them anymore.
Precisely. If sweeping things under the rug no longer works because one toxic manager just invalidated the legal shield for the entire organization, the entire corporate playbook has to fundamentally change.
They have to overhaul everything.
HR departments can no longer afford to default to risk mitigation by firing the complainer. They can no longer tell an executive to just figure out what the toxic boss wants.
Right. Those days are over.
That latter we talked about at the very beginning of the show.
Right.
Companies are going to have to make absolutely certain it is structurally sound for everyone, or the trapdoor is going to drop them straight into a very public federal court.
It's a whole new world for employment law.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us today and letting us unpack the mechanics of this incredible case for you. We hope it gives you a sharper analytical lens to view employment law, corporate structures, and your own rights in the workplace. Until next time, stay informed and keep climbing.
If you like the Employee Survival Guide, I'd really encourage you to leave a review. We try really hard to produce information to you that's informative, that's timely, that you can actually use and solve problems on your own and at your employment. So if you'd like to leave a review anywhere you listen to our podcast, please do so. And leave 5 stars, because anything less than 5 is really not as good, right? I'll keep it up. I'll keep the standards up. I'll keep the information flowing at you. If you'd like to send me an email and ask me a question, I'll actually review it and post it on there. You can send it to carey@capclaw.com. That's capclaw.com.